this is 2 o'clock. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's CTL online session. My name is Wasi Ahmed and I'm working here as an associate professor at the Department of Chemical Engineering. Today we are presenting Research Teaching Nexus, presented by Professor Rohani Topas. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any question during presentation, please type them into the chat box. I will bring them up during the presentation, or we'll also have time for questions at the end. The research teaching nexus refers to any aspect of interplay between teaching and research roles of university, whether at the level of institute, department, or individual academic level. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to Professor Rohani Topas. He teaches sociolinguistics in education at the Institute of Education, University College London. He's an associate editor of International Journal of Sociology of Language, and he has been awarded an honorary lifetime membership by Linguistics Society of the Philippines for his excellent contributions of language studies in the country. For 2 decades, he has worked in language education, language teacher education among students and teachers in Southeast Asia, especially Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines. Over to you, Professor Topas.
Hello. Thank you very much, Dr. Wasi, for your short but warm introduction. And thank you very much also colleagues who are present in today's workshop. Many thanks for coming. And I'm definitely looking forward to a very fruitful dialogue with everyone. Thank you also for Dr. Khalid for the invitation. I met him and his team some time ago. We had also brief but fruitful discussion. And this is a continuation to that particular discussion. All right, so before I start off with my slide, I just would like to, also welcome you to this workshop. This is a particularly interesting workshop that I'm giving because typically I would, provide workshops for colleagues in my respective field or areas that are related to my field, but here I'll be working with and I'll be dialoguing with all of you with quite a variety of interests. And I find that to me very interesting and fascinating because then it contributes to a lot more to the discussion and to the robustness of this question about research and teaching nexus as well. Okay, let me just hold on. Let me just share my slide. Can you see it, Doctor? Is that clear? I hope it's clear.
It's a clear.
Yeah, we can see.
All right, excellent. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so the first few slides, in other words, I think I will have to then try to locate myself in the in this broad field of academic work and academic research in order to make sense of what it is that I'm going to be discussing. So with your indulgence, I'll be talking about my own work. I'll be, in a sense, situating my own examples, of course, within the kinds of work and research and teaching, and also community work that I actually also provide or have been providing for the past 2 decades or so. Um, so much of what I'm going to share with you in the next few slides are things that are really very relevant perhaps to my own field, which is sociolinguistics. But I guarantee you, all of these will have some implications for what I'm going to talk about as far as research and teaching is concerned. A lot of it, of course, has got something to do with my own personal work, my personal experiences with engaging with research and teaching as well. So I start off with something that is very familiar to me, and then hopefully, expand and expand and try to reflect on these experiences in a much broader way as well. All right, so a little bit about myself. In other words, I am Rwani Tupas. I am from the Department of Culture, Communication, and Media of the Institute of Education of the University College London. Prior to this position, I was actually um, for 20 years, an academic, a Filipino academic based in Singapore. I started my teaching at the National University of Singapore for 10 years, and then I moved to the National Institute of Education of Singapore, or of the Nanyang Technological University, where I taught for 7 years. And at in NUS, I was, and I'm going to be making references to this experience later on. I was at the Center for English Language Communication, but more specifically, I was in charge of different English for academic purposes programs in different colleges in the university, but more specifically at the NUS Business School. So at the NUS Business School, I was stationed there for about 10 years, examining, preparing, teaching, and coordinating English language courses, compulsory courses for all business students of the National University of Singapore. And when I moved to the National Institute of Education, of course, that's the only institute of education at in Singapore. So there is a very clear and strong collaborative um, synergy between the National Institute of Education and the Ministry of Education of the government, of course, of the Singapore government as well. So much of what we were doing had much to do with education, with much to do with classroom work and classroom discourses and classroom practices as well. At the master's level, I was the program coordinator of the Master of Arts in Applied Linguistics. And that is basically also what the kind of level that I'm teaching in at the moment at the University College London Institute of Education, also at the MA in Applied Linguistics. So what I'd like to share with you right now um, is something that I did actually just recently, also this week. This is the title of a presentation that I gave to who colleagues who hosted me at the University of Malaya, but of course participants coming from different parts of the world. I was invited to talk about everyday multilingualism and language education, and the question is, how do we bridge the gap? And so when I was invited by your university to talk about the research teaching nexus. It was, in a sense, quite. Um, I was excited to accept the invitation because I was also preparing a few talks along that line as well. Of course, with different sorts of dimensions as my focus. Um, Here, as you can see, the question, well, at least as far as my field is concerned, and I'm sure also in many of the areas that we work in, it's bridging the gap between what we do as scholars and what we do, what happens outside, for example, the classroom, is something that is always at the crux of the matter when it comes to our scholarship and when it comes to pedagogy. It is something, of course, that it doesn't really happen very, very, I mean, it doesn't come up automatically, and that's the kind of question that we need to ask precisely because it's not automatic that we are able to draw that link. And similarly, this is something that I addressed as far as my work as a social linguist is concerned. Social linguistics, of course, is concerned primarily with the study of language and society. And what do we learn about how people behave, how people use language in society, and what do we learn out of that, and the implications, for example, for the classroom, the implications for language pedagogy, and so on and so forth. Now, just to give you also an idea of what I do, because of this, as what this kind of the title that I was invited for, how to bridge the gap between everyday multilingualism, how people use language in everyday communication, and what we do in language education, and more specific and more generally in education. In fact, there's the assumption is that there is a lot of asymmetry in the way we deal with these two realities of our work and profession. And what I was invited precisely because I think I have, for the most part of my work, for the most part of my scholarship as an academic, of course, been actively engaged in figuring out how indeed do we bridge the gap, and how do we indeed we address this inequalities between what happens theoretically, what we know theoretically, and what happens on the ground as well. And here, as you can see in my slide, um, you see some of the articles, not all of these. These are just sample articles that I have written for popular media, for entertainment media, for pop culture media, and but still focused on the same research question that I have been engaged in for the past 20 years or so, and which is the question about multilingual education, and more specifically, the question about inequalities of multilingualism. In other words, how does multilingualism, um, create hierarchies within particular communities and societies, especially in the privileging of certain languages over other languages as well. And so what I try to do is, within pop culture, I look at some of these issues and try to make sense of these issues for those who are not really linguists, for those who are not really scholars, for those who are not really in the academe. So these are titles, for example, as you can see on the screen, these are titles that are now everywhere in Philippine social media. Um, Again, these are not these are just representative titles, but I think you get the point about me trying to reach out to as many people as possible in order to communicate my own research, findings, and my own research um, positions, right, as far as multilingualism and language education is concerned. You will also see there on the right side a screenshot of me being interviewed on radio by two academics, but they have a radio program that happens regularly every week, and the of course the this radio program is meant for teachers. It's meant to raise awareness of teachers, not just competence in how to teach, but basically raise awareness of teachers, sensitivity, awareness of issues that surround them, as part of their own communities and society as well. And here I was invited to talk about, again, of course, my own work on multilingualism and why multilingualism is a resource and not a problem. Also on the left side there, down on the left side, down bottom side of the slide, that is actually also a screenshot of a video of one of the rising boy groups in the Philippines, which is called Alamat. And one of the main objectives of Alamat is the promotion of Philippine languages. And so in the midst of debates, national debates, like thousands of comments and engagements and social media about the relationship or the nature of language and dialects, Alamat, the group, invited me to join the conversation. And so that was again also an opportunity for me to engage um, the young, engaged educators and policymakers, and educational policymakers and administrators in this kind of conversation. I'm sharing this with you because I think these are some of the strategies that I engage in as a scholar and as a researcher, trying to communicate my research with as wide range of people as possible, because it is my belief that it is important that my work, in the field of multilingual education, the field of social linguistics, if it is to make any impact at all, then has to go out of the academe, so to speak. So what did I say? I mean, we don't need to make sense of all of these, but this is what I basically put together as a visual representation of how to bridge the gap. And here I will be talking a little bit about this later on. So we don't really need to discuss all of them. But my point really here really is that my key argument is that there is a lack of, especially in the way we conceptualize, education, not just language education, but conceptualize education on the one hand, and the realities outside education, the realities outside the academe on the other hand, all right, that there is a gap, that does not allow us to bridge the two together. And that is knowledge of the world, that is knowledge about what is happening to reality and to people in actual everyday lives, and as they mobilize themselves, as they mobilize their languages and their cultures, and and certain practices as well. There's such lack of knowledge of, in a sense, generally the world. And if you notice there, some concepts, um, structures of feeling and translingual dispositions. These are mine, this is not the time to talk about these, of course, but these are concepts that I use to make sense of the outside world, of what I've seen, what I've observed, what the kinds of practices that I see, in order to draw the link between outside and the inside. I'm putting these all in quotation marks, of course. And of course, then provide examples of how, specific examples of how these indeed can be bridged, or these indeed how these can translate to actual real practices, in the classroom, for example. So on the one hand, you have additive pedagogy. On the other hand, you have translingual pedagogies. In other words, different ways of embracing and accepting and using these different languages in language education as well. Now, again, it's not the time to discuss everything that's written there. I think the point here really is that this is a visual representation of how one way of visually representing how we can make sense of this relationship between theory and practice, this relationship between what's inside the classroom and outside the classroom, what's the relationship between research and teaching, right? Whereby there is a missing gap in between, and which is, basically making sense of that kind of relationship. How do we make sense of that kind of relationship? Of course, that's part of what I'm going to talk about today. And lastly, about myself, it's also kind of, um, uh, in a sense, a coincidence, if you call it such, that at the moment there was an advertisement from my university, from the Institute of Education, more specifically, of a podcast, of a series of podcasts, that is going to come out in the next few days. And one of such podcasts features me as a scholar, as features me as someone who not just does research, but also does research and helps translate that research to the what you may call real world. So research for the real world actually is a kind of office, a kind of division in the Institute of Education, which promotes or encourages staff not just to to be just not just to surface the kinds of publications that they have, but to encourage staff to think of ways to translate such research for the real world. And as you can see there, not just me, of course, but a couple of other colleagues have also been scheduled for that particular podcast. And if some of you are interested, I can send you, of course, the link to that podcast soon, because it's still going to come out soon on Spotify and in other platforms where podcast is possible as well. So here, I think I'm sharing this with you because I think all of that is important in putting in perspective the kinds of experiences that are needed to be able to make sense, for example, of or to grapple with. I think that's a better word, to grapple with, our you know to grapple with the relationship between research and teaching as well, because it's never straightforward, as you will see. Now, but basic considerations when we start talking about research, teaching, nexus, there are certain basic considerations. I start, for example, with Jenkin and Healy, 2005, and other scholars later on, of the kinds of things that I think we need to ask ourselves first. All right, because the research teaching nexus doesn't come very automatically, as I will explain later on as well. So there are things that I think we need to ask ourselves first, in order for the research and teaching culture nexus to become vibrant in our university and in our institution. So the question, first and foremost, I think the general question is, what is really distinctive about higher education? All right. I think just talking about research and teaching is not enough, and to appreciate it is really need to step back first and foremost and ask ourselves, what is really distinctive about higher education? Is it to help students and the broader society make sense of the complexities of the social conditions within which we live? Is this what is distinctive about higher education? Or do we believe that it is just simply there to support economic growth? Of course, they are not mutually exclusive, but I think these are questions that we need to start asking ourselves. Because if we have no interest, for example, in making sense of complexities of the social conditions within which we live, if we don't want our students, if we don't have a very explicit view of ourselves as helping our students, and the greater community within which we live, make sense of what's going on outside, make sense of what's going on in the world, for example, then it will be very difficult to create that culture of bringing together research and teaching. Because part of what teaching is, really is, to help students reflect on the very conditions within which they are in, as human beings to start with. So I think it's also really very important to first and foremost really think of higher education in particular ways, for this particular culture, the research teaching nexus culture to do well, and not just, of course, a university, or not just supposed to be only to support economic growth, as what the government wants. Of course, there are always, relationships here. There are always overlaps here, but I think these are questions that we need to ask first. Another one is, what are motivations? What are the motivations of staff? What are our motivations and the sense of our role in the university? According to Healy, I think these are shaped by the extent by which we believe in yeah sorry that we believe in the research, the role of the research to student learning and wider society. I think what this means basically is that when the motivations that we have towards, let's say, operationalizing the research teaching nexus is based on, to a large extent, even our own understanding of the role of research in the first place to student learning. If there is no sense of that belief that research has got something to do with student learning, research has got nothing to do with the wider society, then it will also be a very difficult to pitch, this research teaching nexus culture for everyone. Now, of course, we might again ask ourselves, what's with this thing about research to student learning? I mean, isn't that very, very clear that research has to link with student learning and with link with the wider society? Well, yes and no. Yes, because perhaps there has to be that link, but no, but because of the drive in universities around the world, academic competition, for example, for global rankings, certain aspects in academic work are privileged, and certain aspects in the academic world are deprivileged as well, to the point that sometimes your contributions are based solely on perhaps the publications that you produce, the publications that you generate. And so if you have institutions that basically value that and that alone for the sake of global rankings, for example, then it is very difficult to pitch again, or to give people this space to explore the research teaching relationship or link as well. So it's important that we start thinking about their own motivations as well, and our role in the university, and to what extent do we think our research translates to helping students and the wider society. Here, this is what I have been saying all along. What is the link between research and teaching? So there is no, according to Healy, there is no automatic linkage between research and teaching. All right, we have to make that link. Institutions will have to make that link. Teachers, scholars will have to make that link. So there needs to be what, systematic building of this link into institutional infrastructures. Our institutional infrastructures, open up to these kinds of linking between the research and teaching. All right. I know that this is something that is, of course, again, a challenge for everyone, because I come from that experience back in Singapore, for example, where initially there is this push to bring research and teaching together, but the evaluation is very much heavy, for example, on research. But of course, that gradually changed along the way. For example, when they moved to the Institute of National Education, to the to Nanyang Technological University, when at least on paper, research and teaching were given equal points. And so that somehow helped, surface, innovative ways to bring research and teaching together. So I think the point here really is, I'm not here to tell you, so that's the link. I'm here to tell everyone that we need to create that link ourselves. We need to surface those spaces of linkage between research and teaching. So, what is now the general state of relationship between teaching and research in universities around the world? So, I think that's a key question that we need to ask ourselves. Now, according to Weiser in 2018, a very recent article, there is a schism. There's a schism between the knowledge researchers construct and the knowledge that teachers use for teaching. I think that's pretty much clear as far as research in this area is concerned across most contexts in the world. And here we're not just simply, of course, talking of one teacher who is a scholar, or one scholar, and then on the other hand, a teacher, but we're also talking here of someone who does research and who also does teaching. There seems to be, even within individual scholars themselves, a schism between the knowledge that we construct and the knowledge that we as teachers use for teaching. So that's the schism, and therefore, um, the question is, how do we then bring that together, right? As scholars of teachers of teaching, and as teachers or practitioners as well. So I guess I started with these good questions because I think these are important for us to reflect on first and foremost, because we don't want to look at research and teaching, the research and teaching nexus, as something that is isolated from our own philosophies of teaching, from our own understandings of what universities should be or should be like, from the kinds of conditions within which we work in our own specific institutions. These are all important to reflect on in order to make the research teaching nexus work. All right. Okay. So in the next two episodes or two sections of my work, um, work, I will be separating or providing you with examples, my own example of bringing together um, research and teaching. But here, I'd like to show first um, how research translates to teaching. All right. And this is, again, a very personal matter, but hopefully, you will be able to appreciate later on the kinds of reflections that I will make to share with you, so that this is something that hopefully will also be carried over in most fields, if not all fields in the academe, something for us to think about. All right. So first, this slide, don't be overwhelmed by the information here, because I will definitely be explaining, describing it to you. Now, first and foremost, these are worksheets. Okay, we can call them worksheets, we can call them discussion sheets, we can call them whatever we want. But these are basically, questions and, critical incidents that I give to students, whether I am in the Philippines, I am in Singapore, I am in London, teaching both graduate and undergraduate students. Now, on the left there, you will see, okay, that's a worksheet. That's worksheet 8. It was just very recent, actually, in 2018, back in Singapore, where I was teaching the social variation of language to a group of undergraduate students. All right. So as you can see there, I have a worksheet, and then immediately after that come the relevant concepts. Now, every session that I conduct, every session that I have, whether it is undergraduate or graduate, most of these sessions actually make use of these sheets. And I start off with concepts, because I believe that whatever it is that I teach, for example, will need to be consolidated, and they can be consolidated based on the concepts that I teach. So it could be just simply one concept, it could be just simply one theory, it could just simply be one formula, whatever it is, but I highlight that. And then it is these concepts that will then be elaborated on in the kinds of questions that will be asked in this worksheet. So in this worksheet, it could be very general questions, reflective questions. In these worksheets, it could be studies from other scholars. It could be interview excerpts, such as these ones that I have on the left, for example. It could be actually videos on YouTube that I ask them to watch, and then I ask them to discuss. Now, um, you will see there, for example, in the text that is marked in the red, around the red box. I ask students to compare, one teacher's view of language with another teacher's view in language and you know, in the classroom. And these are excerpts, of course, from classrooms, inside the classrooms in Singapore. All right. Now, you will find, like, for example, the one by Anna, all right, you will see there, you will find that it's the same excerpt that I also use actually in my course right now, in a master's course in the Institute of Education in UCL. All right. So this is a, these are excerpts, right? Interview excerpts that I surface, all right, so that students in the class are able to see exactly, all right, how things operationalize as far as the concepts that I teach them are concerned. I think one of the main issues or one of the main problems that usually students grapple with when they're dealing with lectures, when they're dealing with, you know, the kinds of teaching that we provide, is to some extent the lack of examples, the lack of concretization, and the lack of dialogues that surface, you know, that open up to their own voices in relation to certain examples that we give. So I provide them that particular space every session. It doesn't have to be in class. Sometimes back in Singapore, these are online responses that I ask them, you know, extra supplementary online responses, just to get them to think about. So those of them who actually start would like to think more and reflect more on the concepts, look specifically at these interview excerpts, at these examples, at these reflective questions, in order to have a better sense of the concepts that they were taught. Now, this worksheet on the right is a worksheet that, of course, already was a product of online work because of the pandemic. All right. So here, this is the course in English in diverse world context, which actually, was taught this semester. So it was 100% online. Most of our students are everywhere in the world because the university allows our students now to be anywhere else in the world, for as long as there are certain provisions that, you know, of attendance and work and so on and so forth. So here they actually, they're in Zoom, they are in breakout rooms, making, give discussions. At some point, they also discuss the worksheets asynchronously, all right? And then they write down their own group reflections and then post them online. And then I discuss them when I meet them online together. All right. So I think that's a description of this worksheet, and that's a description of the kind of specific approach that I do basically when it comes to you know um, surfacing the nuances of the concepts that I teach them. But the question here, of course, that I'm sure, which is what you might be interested, is what's the point here? What is it got to do with research and teaching? Now, these are interview excerpts. All right, these are interview excerpts that I put in there because I find them fascinating examples of how to surface certain issues that I would like to surface in the context, for example, of the globalization of the English language. Now, so I'll run you through this um, very slowly. Well, it started with this research project. I was principal investigator. I was actually initially co-principal investigator, and then eventually became a principal investigator to help out, basically put together the huge project. Now, this is a project that is funded by the Ministry of Education in Singapore, which allowed us to enter classrooms in Singapore, secondary classrooms in Singapore, and then not just observe classrooms in Singapore, but interview teachers in Singapore. So there came a time when immediately after, a teacher finished her class or his class, we would, just follow this teacher on his or her way out of the classroom, going to the next class, with our tape recorders, with us trying to make sense of what was happening, because we couldn't catch the teacher later on. So we needed to be following this teacher as he or she moved from one class to another. So the idea being here that we wanted to see how, how certain innovations or Ministry of Education demands for changes in the curriculum actually translate to classroom practice. So that's the research project basically that involved me, that involved many colleagues in my department as well. And what happened was, this is something that I would like to share with you. It's something kind of informal because it's on Facebook. What happened was, I became really quite busy, that I never had a chance to to revise some of the work that we did, research on. And if you may, I just would like to read this, a post that I did on Facebook. I wrote on Facebook: freed myself from mundane office work for 1 week, which is of course once in a blue moon, and thus managed to revise several drafts which had not been attended to for months. So one was with Andrew Bernardo, another was with Sheila Wenninger, another with Thomas Kij and Ken Mizusawa, and another with other colleagues as well. So this picture, I said, of strawberries and berries and milkshake and yogurt is my peace offering to co-authors and friends for my slowness and do nothingness. I think I'd like to insert this because it's things are never ideal, in our own world. I think we all know that as well. So I guess my point here is that, based on the research projects that I was principal investigator of, I was working with a few colleagues or many colleagues on certain drafts and certain research papers as well, which eventually, of course, then sent to were completed as manuscripts and then sent to several journals as well. All right. So you can see there we had this research project, and then from that research project, we of course developed some of these, worked on some of this data in order to come up with manuscripts for submissions. And then one of that was published. All right. One of that was published in the Journal of Language, Identity, and Education, mapping out unequal Englishes in English medium classrooms. It is with my colleague, Chila Wenninger, who was again part of the research group, the research project that investigated classroom work and interviewed teachers as well. Now, the reason why I share this with you is because you will find one interview excerpt in the article that was published. All right. Very familiar now. Okay, that's by Anna, right? But Anna talking about, again, or surfacing certain language issues and certain language policies and ideologies along the way. All right. Now, why did I mention this and why did I go through this? And I think I wanted to make to let you see, how these interview excerpts actually travel from this article, all right, back to this, which is where in the worksheet, all right. I think these interview excerpts, in other words, did not just simply come from nowhere. These interview excerpts came from research and deep theoretical reflections on what they actually contribute as far as nuancing certain issues in the field that we are investigating are concerned. All right, and because of that, I tried to bring that research finding into the classroom, into the worksheet, and get all my students to start thinking about these issues as well. Now, one thing that is, of course, really advantageous to doing this or talking about this is because when there are certain issues that come up in the discussions, you as a scholar, as a researcher who have been reading and analyzing and have been, aware of the conditions within which these interview excerpts emerge, have a very, very, how should I say, have a quite kind of like a complex sense of where the interview excerpts coming from. So there is, some kind of, confidence that you feel talking about these interview excerpts because you grappled with this data, you work with this data, you were there interviewing teachers, or you were there in the classroom, you were there, feeling it, you know, such that when you actually communicate it to students, and when students provide you with examples, the kinds of dialogues that emerge from, these worksheets are, I think, to me, really kind of really fascinating. Um, So what do we see here? So let me bring us all back again to the link between research and teaching. And here again, you have Jenkin and Healy in 2005 telling us that there really is no automatic linkage between research and teaching. Thus, this needs to be systematically built into institutional infrastructures. But what do we get out of that experience? Just very simple experience, basically, of mine, looking at research and how it translated to teaching. Well, first, of course, I think we really need to create spaces to establish the link, all right? And these spaces don't need to be difficult and difficult to create. These spaces could be worksheets, for example. These spaces, in some people may not necessarily be um, happy with the use of the word worksheet, so I'm fine with that. So you can talk about discussion points, for example. So it's fine for as long as you have spaces to establish the link. Where can we establish the link? Where can that appear? Where our research translates to what we can do in in the classroom. Now, this is, of course, just simply one space, one possibility, and one option for us to make that particular link. But actually, there are many other ways to do that. Of course, here I'm talking about it in the context of, us as individual teachers making that link, but it could also be, you know, leveled up to, let's say, curriculum development, for example, and even, more like the departmental level and so on and so forth. But even within the individual level, no, I wasn't just simply using the interview data, actually. I was also using some of the videos that we used. Of course, all the ethical considerations being addressed, like, for example, the names are taken off and so on and so forth. I showed video clips of the interviews. I showed video clips, for example, of the teachers in the classroom, for example, and sometimes not only mine, but also, that of my colleagues. I can, also show it to them, really just to establish that link between our own research and our own teaching. So there is that particular way, for example, and it doesn't have to be grand, if you call it such. And another is, really, we need to align research concepts with teaching concepts. So if you probably now understand why I started with describing the worksheets that I use, that before the questions, I put in there the concepts, or probably call them theories, and sometimes even the issues. All right. So these are the issues. These are the key theoretical issue. This is the key political issue. These are the concepts that we tackled in this session, or this week, or in the past 2 weeks, so that then all of the discussions, all of the questions that will come after this part will need to be able to hopefully elaborate on or surface an understanding, a critical understanding of these issues that you highlight for that particular week. So there is a possibility, in other words, to draw that connection between research and teaching in this particular area, um, by thinking about what sort of research concepts do we go by, what sort of research concepts um, do we actually generate as researchers and scholars, and perhaps there are certain concepts in our teaching or in the content of our teaching, all right, not just the pedagogy of it, but the content of our pedagogy, that concepts that then we can bring together in order to align our research and teaching. So this is not so much, again, I don't think it's a lot of work. It's just a matter of, again, making explicit the desire to make that particular link. So create spaces to establish that link and align those research concepts with the concepts that we use in our teaching. Okay, now before I move on to the next one, all right, may I ask if there are questions um, or clarification?
Yes, Professor. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, all right,
Yes,
all
no
right.
problem.
Okay, so that one was research to teaching. Okay, and in my meeting with Dr. Khalid and his team, the past week or so, um, the the idea is also to see how teaching, can feed into our own research. And I'm happy to be able to do that as well, because that's also something that I have been grappling with myself throughout my career as a social linguist, as a language educator. So the earlier example that I gave is, of course, the example of how research translates to teaching. But here, then, how is it possible to do teaching translating to research as well? So again, I'm going to share with you my own example, personal example of how that actually came about. Now, um, let me start with, like, more than a decade ago. I think I mentioned this earlier at the start of my talk. I was teaching and coordinating the English language courses at the NUS, the National University of Singapore Business School. And one of these courses is a compulsory course, then a compulsory course of business communication, which was to basically be given out to all students of the NUS Business School. And um, part of that of that role is to bring in more of issues that have got to do with interpersonal as well as intercultural communication. All right. So if you look here, all right, again, I deploy the same sort of strategy. Sessions would have certain worksheets. Sessions would have certain discussion points or issues to basically support the talk, the presentations, to support the lectures, and so on and so forth. Now, um, you look at the one on the right, you know, it is part, actually, it's not complete, but it is actually part of a description of three people supposedly coming from different parts of Asia, or different parts, no, not different parts of Asia, but three individuals working in the corporate world. And the idea being that it will draw or surface the differences in communication styles and cultural strategies of these people. So Conrad Paracuelis, for example, has studied and worked in the Philippines. Okay, and Faiza is a marketing strategist from Malaysia, right? And Laura is from the United States. Okay, now in using these information, however, one thing that I realized, one thing that I observed, however, in the class, is that a lot of stereotyping was happening, was going on. All right. And the reason being that because the description of Conrad is that he is from the Philippines, there students' stereotypes about Filipinos then start surfacing. All right. Oh, he speaks like that because he is Filipino. or Faiza like that is speaks like that because she's Malaysian, for example. Oh, Laura is like that because she's American. So the description that you provide, that I provide in these, in these examples, all right, that we describe these people, all right, did not really help in intercultural communication. It helped, in a sense, even made it worse by stereotyping people from different parts of the region, different countries, and so on and so forth. And so I needed to intervene as, of course, as the designer of the course and basically say, this cannot be like this. We need to do something with the design of the courses. We need to do something with the design of the worksheets in order to avoid such stereotyping. All right. And so what happened was, based on the 2008, excerpt, we changed that, we transformed that into something much more um, different. So, for example, here, let me read it. In an excerpt of a meeting below, three top executives of Finance Asia discuss how best to proceed with revenue growth strategies. So Conrad Paracuelas, who has studied and worked in the Philippines, Singapore, and Germany, is the assistant director for research. All right. So you notice there that in the original worksheet, in the original description, Conrad Paracuelas studied and worked in the Philippines. But here now, Conrad Paracuelas has worked and trained and studied in the Philippines, Singapore, and Germany. The justification here basically is that when people would like to make sense of how Conrad speaks and how Conrad communicates, you have to bring into consideration the fact that he comes from multicultural environments, and you cannot just simply reduce him to one particular writing style. That you cannot just simply reduce him to one communication style. And you have Faiza, who trained as a marketing strategist in multinational companies based in Malaysia and the United States. All right, so the same thing. We complexified and so on and so forth. The description of individuals in this particular worksheet. And then you have Laura, who is the managing and director of the entire company and is the most senior of the three. Okay, she has most decades of banking experience in several Asian countries. So she is, um, she has the most, banking experience in several Asian countries. All right, but you only have references to her name as Laura Smith, but not really from where she is from, right? But she has experience, banking experience in several Asian countries. Again, um, the idea being that all of these characters and all these persons describe have complex experiences in terms of culture, in terms of communication, and so on and so forth. So what we did is also to firm up that conceptual point about intercultural communication, that we talked about intercultural communication not only in terms of national cultures. So you see there on the slides on the lower bottom, the bottom right of the slide, that when you talk about cultural differences, you talk about not just simply national cultural differences, but you talk about social group differences. You talk about differences according to ethnic groups, according to genders, even generational, intergenerational changes as well, corporate and workplace cultures, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, we, all of us actually, when we generate cultural, practices, we generate cultural practices that are born out of not just being from the same from a certain country or culture, national culture, but coming from, let's say, the academic culture as well, from the culture of parenting as well, and so on and so forth. So many of these come into together. So how then will students make sense of communication practices in the workplace with all of these? All right. So you notice there that from the start of the you know the worksheet, we revised, in order to make sense of, to help students grapple with questions of stereotyping. We had to intervene, in other words. And so that translated to some kind of reflective research on my part, which came out in an online blog, an article that, of course, was still, um, refereed, but in a, in a teaching based research blog. And the idea here is that I talk about and reflected on how insertions and interruptions, very small, very little insertions and interruptions in our teaching could actually help challenge stereotypes in our work. And what I did there was to surface, these three strategies. First, you insert diversity into participants' background. So this is what I did in my work earlier. I, instead of just simply saying Conrad Paracueles started, it's come from the Philippines, and I inserted, more diversity into his experience in order to make, to be, more complex, which is the way it is, because I know Mr. Paracueles myself. He's a good friend of mine who is actually really trained in, and who studied in different parts of the world as well. I also tried to avoid pronoun references to gender, for example, because FISA, in the examples that I gave, the communication dialogues, meeting dialogues that I gave, FISA is kind of strong, very straightforward and very direct, and without, if in the original description, um, students would always refer to FISA as male, precisely of the directness of the communication style. But, actually, FISA is female, which means that, FISA is also capable of, direct modes of communication. And of course, diversify patterns of communication. I guess the point here really is that what I did was to look at, reflect on deeply or probe into what was going on in the classroom and the kinds of work that I was doing um, in the classroom and reflected on them. But I did not stop there. All right. So these are, of course, deep probing reflections, but I did not stop there. I started again reflecting theoretically about what was going on in this particular classroom. All right. I started basically asking myself, what does this mean theoretically to, let's say, intercultural communication? What does this mean theoretically to intercultural education, for example? And so what I did was to use the same material, all right, come up with a research design, all right, and then capture some of the responses of the students in order to still make sense of what was going on as far as the use of these materials is concerned. And so what happened was this indeed therefore developed into a research design investigating student responses to materials, right? This developed into a robust research, in other words, to basically address and capture some of the responses of the students as well. And what happened? Published. All right. So it got published in Intercultural Education, the Journal of Intercultural Education. The title of which, of course, is Intercultural Education in Everyday Practice. Now you will see here, for example, that the entire article was indeed really going back to how I described it to you earlier. These are my reflections of teaching and designing for business communication for the second year level undergraduate courses of the School of Business of the National University of Singapore. You will also find here in text A, the text here below, familiar prompts because I shared them with you earlier. These were prompts that actually started in the worksheet. So you had the original one, which again just basically gave you very straightforward description of the participants, which resulted in the stereotyping of these participants. And then another example of a revision of the prompt, which then surfaced and complexified, the characters and the cultures and the communicative repertoires of these characters or these personalities in the prompt as well. So you see there, if you notice, what you see in this research is what began as worksheet material. All right. In the earlier section that I gave you, what you see in the worksheet were interview excerpts which were originally found in the research paper. All right. So on the one hand, you had worksheets capturing some of the research that I actually produced and generated. On the other hand, I have research that also, like this one, that also captured what I've done in the classroom. All right. So if the earlier one was researched and translated into my own teaching, this one is also teaching, which translated to my own research. So just to as a kind of conclusion, therefore, all right, and to allow everyone to also now start asking questions and hopefully participating in the discussion, I started with these two big points, I think, about the teaching research nexus. One is really we need to create spaces to establish the link, right? Again, it is not very automatic that the spaces are there. We have to create them ourselves. And we need to align research concepts with the concepts that we use in teaching, not just the pedagogical concepts, of course, but the concepts that we use in teaching. Because if we can align them, then that's when we can actually start surfacing that link. Also, based on the example that I just gave you just a while ago, we need to interrogate our own teaching practices, right? What I did basically was not to be complacent about my own materials, right? I saw that there was something problematic in the way our students responded to my material. And to be able to change that, I needed, of course, to rewrite the materials, redesign the materials, hopefully to make sense of, or in other words, to capture some of those that I really wanted to capture from the student responses. Now, of course, interrogating on responses and intervening, in the way your materials work, for example, is one thing. But investigating and figuring out in more empirical sense, in more rigorous sense, for example, is another. In other words, we can, of course, interrogate, we can make changes, but I think it is also important to systematically figure out, what are the results, what are the responses to, what is the impact of such interrogated, with such the impact of such interrogation on student learning, for example, or what is the impact of such interrogation on on teacher effectiveness, for example. I think that's also very, very important to highlight. And lastly, all right, then I think we can draw up research designs from the classroom. It is possible, but I think we need to have, we need to start off with such interrogating, lenses. In other words, I don't think we can just come in and start basically drawing up research designs without necessarily interrogating our own classrooms as well. It is important that we start with that in order to come up with these research designs from the classroom. So it's possible, where that, in other words, how you start off, where you start off in the research teaching link. It's possible to start off with your own research. It's also possible to start off with your own teaching. Some of you may be more comfortable, or be more um, um, familiar with the how to navigate your own research um, culture, for example, or your own research experiences, and that's fine. The question, therefore, is now how do you create that space to establish the link with your teaching, and perhaps how which sort of concepts in your research will now translate to your own teaching. But there are those, of course, who are also really more comfortable with their own teaching as well. Those who are more amenable to, becoming, effective, outstanding teachers. That's also fine. But then, the process of interrogation and reflection, all right, um, can begin possible research designs and possible ways to investigate your own practices as well in the classroom. Okay. All right. So I think that's about it for me, and I'm looking forward to some of your questions. Thank you, and I think that's how we say it in the Philippines. Maraming salamat po. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tupas. We will go ahead and take some time for question now. Just waiting for some question from our audience. Let's see, Professor.
Let me just can I stop the sharing now?
You have already stopped.
Oh, I did. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh, in if you will talk about in my perspective, like in the chemical engineering, what we do, the thing which we are teaching here, okay, and we are applying same thing in the research actually. So the
Okay.
undergrad students, suppose we are teaching how you will make the soft drink, okay, in the
Sure.
theory classes, and same thing we are doing in the practical classes, and then
Mm.
we are just developing their research skill, that how you will improve the quality of that soft drink. Okay,
Mm.
this is what we are doing. What we are connecting from the first day to the last day, and then from last 3 4 years in the Department of Chemical Engineering, students are publishing a good paper. In fact, undergrad students.
Excellent.
Yeah, this is
Mm.
what we are doing here in the
Yes, yes. Actually, there is one very broad dimension in the research teaching nexus, which is really focused on developing research skills as well. So it may not. So it even in in our own field. So it's not so much the content, all right, but in developing students probing and investigating skills, because I think because of the need for students to be able to conduct research in particular ways. I think we know for a fact that different cultures, different disciplines would have their own systems of ways of probing and investigating as well, right? And that definitely, I think you are definitely very right. I mean, that actually goes across all disciplines. There is a position on that in terms of research and teaching, where we focus on getting students, to be sensitized to, research, how to do research and how to conduct research, because that is something that they also would need, in the so-called in the real world or in the industries as well.
Yeah, it's also actually a mission of Dhofar University, that how we will align all the teaching, in the research. So yes, we are, and from your presentation and from your experience, I came to know that yes, we are actually going in the right direction, and I hope so. I mean, within few years, maybe 5 or 6 years, we will be in the good shape. Now we are in the good. I mean that we are improving day by day.
Sure.
This is, yeah. From, I mean
The
that, yeah.
one thing that I notice, of course, in working with certain institutions, is this something that probably you can discuss, if you can, of course, is that the difficulty, therefore, of evaluating faculty based on the effectiveness of bringing together research and teaching. How does that work in your university? I think that's something that I'm very interested in.
Yeah, here in our university, actually the professor or faculty will be evaluated according to their in three categories. They have, I mean, the university has divided in three categories. One is teaching, that is around 40%. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and that will be evaluated by the students definitely. Okay,
Okay.
what you are teaching in the classes. Okay, and 10% is from the community service, that which type of the you are you are doing the something for the community. Suppose you are cleaning the beach, you are awareing that there is no smoking zone, or you cannot smoke, better to not smoke, like that type of thing. That is the community service. And that is a 50%. Now the 50% is coming from the research actually. So the
Mm,
faculty is evaluated in all the three frameworks: teaching, community service, and research. So forty,
okay.
10, and 50, this is what
Okay, all
here
right.
is the idea.
Where I come from, for example, at the National Institute of Education in Singapore, all
Mhm.
right. Research and teaching. I mean, for those in the tenure track, of course, research and teaching are evaluated equally. All right. So I think they have a certain system that doesn't really go for that doesn't count up to 100 to 100%, but it's like 6 and 6, six for
Okay.
teaching and 6 for research, for example, and
Mhm.
then let's say 2 for service, for example.
Okay, okay.
So then of course when it comes to teaching, then
Mhm.
um, definitely what need to be done is not just simply student evaluation, but you need to surface, indeed, your ability to translate your own research into your teaching as well. And that's the reason why every year we would always surface all these worksheets. And that's why, in my research, in my presentation today, I have all of these worksheets, because we needed to show, you know the kinds of innovation that we produce in our worksheets, in our materials, um, to be able to showcase the relationship between research as well as teaching, and our teaching as well. Now in my university now, it's quite kind of slightly different, because we have different positions. So in our case, again, it's research and teaching, basically given equally, but we have colleagues who are also of equal status, right? But who are more towards the research side. But we also have colleagues who are more towards the teaching side. But
Okay.
again, the expectations are different, of course. But we are, in other words, we have the same status. We have the same, basically titles, if you come to think of it. So the expectations are different. But the idea being that I think there is still this need for everyone to make that link as well. All right.
Yes.
It may not be necessarily a demand for one group of people, but for other groups of people, maybe a little bit more. But there's that need to bring the two together.
Okay. Uh, Thank you very much, Professor Tupas, and it's our pleasure. And
Mhm.
again, we have learned, or we have understand so many things from your experience, and definitely we will implement in our teaching and research. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation as well. Yeah.
Sure. Okay.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.